Chapter 3, Unit 3, Period 3, 1754 to 1800. Part 3.1, Contextualizing Period 3. Setting the stage, why 1754 to 1800 changes everything. All right, let's talk about one of the most dramatic half-centuries in all of American history, a period so packed with revolution, reinvention, and raw political experimentation that it makes every other era look a little sleepy by comparison. Period 3, running from 1754 to 1800, is essentially the story of how a collection of British colonies became something the world had never quite seen before, a democratic republic built on Enlightenment ideals. But here's the thing. That transformation didn't happen in a clean, heroic straight line. It was messy, contested, and genuinely uncertain at every turn. And that complexity is exactly what the AP exam wants you to understand. Think of period 3 like a pressure cooker. For decades before 1754, the colonies had been simmering, developing their own economic interests, their own local governments, their own sense of identity. Then the French and Indian War turns up the heat dramatically. And by 1776, the whole thing explodes. Your job is to understand not just what happened, but why the conditions were already in place for it to happen. That's what contextualizing means on the AP exam, zooming out to see the big forces at work before you zoom back in on specific events. The big forces shaping the period. 3 enormous forces define this era, and you want to keep all 3 in your head at once. First, there's the legacy of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Britain wins, but winning turns out to be expensive, ruinously so. To pay those war debts, Parliament starts taxing the colonies in ways it never had before, cracking open a constitutional debate about representation, sovereignty, and the rights of Englishmen that spirals almost inevitably toward independence. Remember this, the revolution doesn't start with a sudden burst of patriotism. It starts with a tax bill. Second, you have the Enlightenment as an intellectual engine. The American founders weren't just angry colonists throwing tea into harbors. They were deeply read political thinkers who had absorbed the ideas of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Concepts like natural rights, the social contract, and the separation of powers weren't abstract philosophy to them. They were blueprints. When Jefferson writes Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, he's translating Locke's life, liberty, and property into something even more radical and universal. That intellectual context is crucial for the AP exam, especially in essay prompts about the ideological origins of the revolution. Third, and this one students often underestimate, is the question of who gets to be part of this new republic. The ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, self-governance, immediately collide with the realities of slavery, the displacement of Native Americans, and the limited rights of women. This tension isn't a footnote. It's one of the central themes the AP exam returns to again and again. The founders essentially wrote a check of freedom that large portions of the population weren't allowed to cash. Common AP pitfalls to avoid. Here's where a lot of students stumble. They treat the revolution as the end of period 3 rather than the middle, the years between 1783 and 1800, the Articles of Confederation era, the Constitutional Convention, Washington's presidency, the rise of the first political parties are just as exam-worthy and arguably more complex. The question of how to govern a republic turns out to be as hard as winning independence in the first place. The Articles of Confederation failed not because the founders were naive, but because the balance between state power and national authority was a genuinely hard problem. When you get to the Constitution, see it not as an obvious solution, but as a deeply controversial compromise that nearly didn't happen. Another pitfall. Don't flatten the Loyalists out of the story. Roughly 1/3 of colonists remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution. That fact alone should remind you that independence was not inevitable or universally popular. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand the Revolution as a civil conflict as much as a war against a foreign power. Mnemonic to tie it together. Try this. FAE, or War's Words and Who's Left Out. The war's French and Indian Revolutionary reshape political and economic relationships. The words Enlightenment philosophy, founding documents, political debates give the era its intellectual DNA. And Who's Left Out? enslaved people, indigenous nations, women, non-property owners defines the limits and contradictions of the new republic. Every major development in period 3 connects back to at least one of these 3 threads, and the very best AP essays weave all 3 together. Why this period still echoes today. Here's a thought worth carrying with you. The arguments people had in the 1780s and 1790s about federal power versus state power, about who counts as a full citizen, about what liberty actually means in practice. Those arguments are still very much alive. The founders didn't resolve them. They deferred them, sometimes brilliantly and sometimes tragically. That's not a criticism. It's a reminder that period 3 isn't ancient history. It's the original blueprint for debates America is still having. With that foundation firmly in place, let's move into the specific events and turning points that define period 3, starting with the conflict that lit the fuse, the French and Indian War. Part 3.2, the 7 Years War, the French and Indian War. All right, let's talk about one of the most consequential conflicts in American history. A war that most people have never heard of, even though it basically set the stage for the American Revolution. I'm talking about the 7 Years War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War. And here's your first AP pitfall to avoid right now. The name French and Indian War does not mean it was a war between the French and the Indians. It was a war where the British colonists fought against the French and their Native American allies. Get that straight before test day. The roots of the conflict. Think of North America in the 1750s like a crowded parking lot where 3 very aggressive drivers, Britain, France, and various native nations, are all circling the same spot. The Ohio River Valley was that parking spot. The French had built a string of forts through the region. The British colonists wanted to expand westward, and native nations like the Iroquois Confederacy were playing both sides to protect their own sovereignty and trade networks. When a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, led a skirmish against French forces in 1754 at Fort Necessity, he essentially threw the first punch in a global war. The conflict spread to Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, which is why historians outside the U.S. call it the 7 Years War, 1756 to 1763. The Albany Plan of Union. Before the war even went global, colonial leaders met in 1754. At the Albany Congress, and Benjamin Franklin proposed something radical, the Albany Plan of Union. The idea was to unite the colonies under a single governing body to coordinate defense. It was rejected both by the colonial assemblies who didn't want to give up power and by the British Crown who didn't want the colonies getting too cozy with self-governance. For the AP exam, remember this moment as an early, failed attempt at colonial unity. It's a preview of things to come. Turning points and British victory. The war went badly for Britain at first. General Braddock's disastrous 1755 campaign, where his rigid European-style formations got shredded by French and native fighters using guerrilla tactics in the forest, showed just how different American warfare was. Think of it like bringing a chess strategy to a game of dodgeball. But then William Pitt took over as British Secretary of State and changed everything. Pitt poured money and resources into the war, promising to reimburse the colonies for their contributions by 1759. The British had captured Quebec in a dramatic battle on the Plains of Abraham, and by 1760, Montreal fell. The war was effectively over in North America. The Treaty of Paris, 1763. The 1763 Treaty of Paris is one of those documents you absolutely need to know for the AP exam. Britain gained enormous territory. Canada from France, Florida from Spain, who had joined France late in the war, and control over land east of the Mississippi River. France was virtually erased from North America. Spain, as a consolation prize from France, received the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi. Draw this mental map clearly. It matters for everything that comes next. The Proclamation of 1763 and growing tensions. Here's where things get really interesting. Even as Britain celebrated victory, a massive native uprising called Pontiac's Rebellion erupted in 1763 as tribes resisted British expansion into the Ohio Valley. The British response was the Proclamation of 1763, which drew an imaginary line along the Appalachian Mountains and told colonists, don't go west of this line, to the Crown. This was a sensible solution to prevent expensive frontier wars. To colonists who had just fought a war partly to gain access to Western land, it felt like a slap in the face. They largely ignored it. The financial fallout and seeds of revolution. Here's the single most important cause and effect relationship you need to own for this section. The 7 Years' War left Britain with a massive debt. The British government, quite reasonably from their perspective, looked at the prosperous American colonies and said, "You benefited from this war. You're going to help pay for it." What followed was a cascade of taxation, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and others that colonists saw as violations of their rights as Englishmen. The phrase taxation without representation was born directly from this financial crisis. So remember this chain: war, debt, taxation, colonial resistance, revolution. The 7 Years' War didn't just precede the revolution, it caused it. The Native American dimension. Don't sleep on the Native perspective for the AP exam. Many tribes had used European rivalries as a balancing act, playing French against British to maintain power. Once France was gone, that leverage evaporated. Native nations now faced a single dominant British and eventually American power with no competitor to check its expansion. This is a crucial long-term consequence the exam loves to test. With the British now masters of North America, but drowning in debt, the question of who would control the colonies and who would pay for their protection was about to ignite one of the most dramatic political transformations in world history. Part 3.3, Taxation without Representation. The setup, Britain's wallet problem. All right, picture this. It's 1763, and Britain has just finished fighting one of the most expensive wars in its history, the 7 Years' War, which you probably know better by its American chapter, the French and Indian War. Britain won, sure, but winning cost a fortune. The national debt had nearly doubled, and someone had to pay for all those soldiers, all those ships, all that gunpowder. Britain looked across the Atlantic at its American colonies that had frankly benefited enormously from British military protection, and thought they should chip in. That logic wasn't entirely unreasonable. The problem was how Britain went about it. The Proclamation of 1763, the match that lit the fuse. Before we even get to taxes, we need to talk about the Proclamation of 1763 because it set the tone for everything that followed. After the war, Britain drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and told colonists they couldn't settle west of it. The official reason was to prevent more costly conflicts with Native Americans. The colonial reaction, though, was fury. Many colonists had fought in that war, specifically hoping to grab Western land. This was the first big signal that Britain intended to manage the colonies more tightly than before, and colonists didn't like the feeling one bit. The Revenue Acts, a parade of bad ideas. Now the taxes start rolling in, and here's where you need to know your specific legislation for the AP exam. Think of these acts like a greatest hits album of colonial grievances, each one worse than the last. The Free Sugar Act of 1764 actually lowered an existing tax on molasses, but here's the twist: Britain actually started enforcing it this time. Previously, the tax was so high that merchants just bribed customs officials and moved on. Now, Britain was serious about collection. Colonists responded with economic arguments. Primarily, the Parliament had no right to tax them for revenue purposes. That distinction matters. Taxes for regulating trade? Fine. Taxes purely to raise money? That's where colonists drew the line. Then comes the Stamp Act of 1765, and this one was a different animal entirely. This was a direct tax on paper. Every legal document, newspaper, pamphlet, even playing cards needed a government stamp. Think of it like being charged a fee every time you printed something. The genius of this tax from Britain's perspective was that it touched everyone. The problem from Britain's perspective was that touching everyone meant everyone got angry: lawyers, printers, merchants, tavern owners. These happened to be exactly the kinds of people who could write pamphlets, organize protests, and make a lot of noise. The colonial response gave us the famous rallying cry: no taxation without representation. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 brought delegates from 9 colonies together, a remarkable act of intercolonial cooperation at a time when colonies mostly minded their own business. This is a critical concept for the AP exam. The colonial resistance to taxation was simultaneously a political philosophy argument and a practical organizing moment that built the infrastructure for later revolution. Virtual versus actual representation. Know this cold. Here's where the philosophical debate gets sharp, and the AP exam loves to test it. When colonists said they had no representation in Parliament, Britain responded with the idea of virtual representation and the notion that Parliament represented all British subjects everywhere, not just the people who voted for specific members. Every member of Parliament, Britain argued, looked out for the whole empire. Colonists rejected this completely, insisting on actual representation, the idea that only representatives you directly elected could legitimately tax you. This wasn't just a squabble over semantics. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of government itself. Keep that tension in your mind, because it echoes through every confrontation that follows. The repeal and the cycle continues. Colonial resistance, boycotts, the Sons of Liberty, intimidation of tax collectors worked well enough that the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. But here is the AP pitfall students fall into all the time. Don't think Britain backed down because it agreed with the colonists. On the same day, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. It passed the Declaratory Act, which flatly stated that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Britain was essentially saying, we'll stop this time, but don't get any ideas. Then came the Townshend Acts of 1767, a new round of taxes on imported goods like glass, paper, and tea. Charles Townshend thought he'd found a clever workaround. These were external taxes on trade, not direct internal taxes like the Stamp Act. The colonists, who had already sharpened their arguments, weren't buying the distinction anymore. More boycotts, more unrest, and eventually more British troops in American cities, which, as you can imagine, did absolutely nothing to calm anyone down. The big picture, the AP wants you to see. What's really happening in this period is a slow, accelerating breakdown of the imperial relationship. Each British action triggers a colonial reaction, and each colonial reaction hardens British resolve, which triggers a stronger colonial reaction. The taxes aren't just about money. They're cracking open much deeper questions about sovereignty, rights, and the limits of power. Mnemonic worth keeping. SPTD, sugar, proclamation, stamp, Townshend, to remember the sequence of escalating tensions with colonial identity sharpening and the political arguments growing more sophisticated by the year. It's only a matter of time before these disagreements move from pamphlets and protests into something far more dramatic, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 3.4, Philosophical Foundations of the American Revolution. The big idea. Revolution doesn't start with muskets. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The American Revolution was won in the minds of colonists before a single shot was fired at Lexington or Concord. The ideas that justified breaking from Britain didn't appear out of thin air in 1776. They had been simmering in books, pamphlets, and coffeehouse debates for decades, even centuries. Understanding where those ideas came from is exactly what this section is all about. And the AP exam loves to test whether you can connect the intellectual dots. John Locke and the blueprint for revolution. If the American Revolution had a philosophical architect, his name was John Locke. This 17th century English thinker argued something genuinely radical for his time, that governments don't get their authority from God or from tradition. They get it from the consent of the governed people, Locke said, are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Government's job is to protect those rights, and if it fails, the people have the right to overthrow it and build something better. Sound familiar? It should. When Jefferson sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, he was essentially paraphrasing Locke. That famous trio, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is a direct echo of Locke's framework, with property swapped for happiness. Here's a classic AP pitfall. Students sometimes assume Jefferson invented these ideas. He didn't. He applied them. Jefferson himself called the Declaration an expression of the American mind, drawing on ideas already widely shared among educated colonists. The Enlightenment. reason as a revolutionary tool, Locke was part of a much broader intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. And you need to understand it as the ocean that these revolutionary ideas swam in. Enlightenment thinkers believed that human reason, not religious authority, not royal tradition, was the proper guide to organizing society. They looked at institutions the way a scientist looks at a hypothesis. If it doesn't hold up to scrutiny, revise it or throw it out. Think of it this way. If medieval Europe said things are this way because God and the king say so, the Enlightenment fired back with prove it. That skeptical, rational spirit made revolution not just possible, but philosophically justifiable. Other key Enlightenment thinkers the AP expects you to know include Montesquieu, whose work The Spirit of the Laws gave Americans the idea of separation of powers, the checks and balances system baked into the Constitution. If Locke gave colonists the reason to revolt, Montesquieu helped them design what came after. Republican ideas and the country ideology. Beyond Locke and the Enlightenment, American colonists were also deeply influenced by a tradition called republicanism, and here's where students often get tripped up. Republicanism in this context doesn't mean the Republican Party. It refers to a political philosophy emphasizing civic virtue, the common good, and suspicion of concentrated power. Colonists drew heavily on classical Rome and Greece, seeing themselves as modern-day Roman citizens defending liberty against a corrupt, tyrannical empire, in this case, Britain. This connects to something historians call the country ideology, a strain of English political thought that viewed standing armies, excessive taxation, and government corruption as existential threats to liberty. When Parliament started taxing the colonies without their consent, colonists didn't just feel annoyed. They felt like they were watching the very playbook of tyranny unfold in real time. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts, each one confirmed what their political philosophy had already told them to fear. Common sense and pamphlet culture. You also need to know Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776. Paine did something remarkable. He took Enlightenment philosophy and translated it into plain, accessible language that everyday colonists could read, discuss, and feel. He didn't just argue that independence was philosophically justified. He argued it was common sense, almost obvious. He attacked the very institution of monarchy as absurd, asking why anyone should inherit the right to rule simply because of the family they were born into. Common Sense sold roughly 500,000 copies. In a population of about 2.5 million, proportionally, one of the best-selling works in American history. The AP may ask you to evaluate its significance, and the answer is straightforward. It bridged the gap between elite philosophical theory and popular revolutionary sentiment. Moved independence from an idea debated in drawing rooms to a cause embraced in taverns and on farms. The AP takeaway. When you see a question about the philosophical foundations of the revolution, anchor your answer in 3 core relationships. First, Enlightenment thought provided the intellectual framework, reason, natural rights, and the right to revolt. Second, Locke's social contract theory gave the colonists a moral and political justification they could point to directly. Third, Republican ideology gave them a narrative, a story of virtuous citizens resisting corrupt tyranny that made the revolution feel not just necessary, but heroic. A helpful mnemonic, L-E-L-E-R-L-H-E, Locke, Enlightenment. Republicanism, those 3 pillars will carry you through almost any AP question on this topic. Now that you understand the ideas fueling the revolution, let's look at how those ideas translated into actual political conflict. Because the road from philosophy to independence ran straight through a series of escalating clashes with British authority. Part 3.5, The American Revolution. From protest to war, the breaking point. All right, let's talk about one of the most consequential ruptures in modern history. The moment 13 colonies decided they were done being British subjects and were ready to become something entirely new. The American Revolution didn't just happen overnight, though. Think of it like a marriage that had been going sour for years. By the time someone files for divorce, there's been a long accumulation of grievances, and by 1775, the colonists had been mentally drafting the paperwork for over a decade. The roots run directly back to the aftermath of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, which you covered in Section 3.3. Britain emerged from that war victorious, but financially wrecked. Think of them as someone who just won a bidding war on a house they couldn't actually afford to pay off those war debts. Parliament began taxing the colonies directly with measures like the Stamp Act, 1765, and the Townshend Act, 1767. The colonists' response, no taxation without representation, was about more than just money. It was a philosophical argument rooted in English constitutional tradition. They believed that only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them. Parliament disagreed, and that disagreement was the fault line everything else collapsed into. Ideology and the revolutionary mind. Here's where the AP exam loves to trip people up. The revolution wasn't just a military conflict, it was an ideological revolution first. The colonists were deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers, especially John Locke, who argued that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed and that people have the natural right to overthrow a government that violates their rights to life, liberty, and property. Sound familiar? Thomas Jefferson practically lifted that framework wholesale. When drafting the Declaration of Independence in 1776, swapping Locke's property for the pursuit of happiness, the Declaration did something profound. It reframed a tax dispute as a universal moral argument. Jefferson wasn't just saying, we don't like British policy. He was saying tyranny is illegitimate anywhere. For anyone, that universalist language would later haunt American history by raising the obvious question, what about enslaved people? Keep that tension in mind, because the AP exam will absolutely ask you about it. The war itself, key turning points. Militarily, the revolution looked pretty bleak for the Americans in the early going. The British had the most powerful military in the world. The Continental Army was underfunded, undertrained, and perpetually on the edge of dissolving. George Washington's genius was less about winning battles and more about not losing the war, keeping the army alive and functional long enough for circumstances to shift. Think of him as a coach who keeps running out the clock until an opportunity opens up. That opportunity came at Saratoga in 1777, and this is your single most important battle to remember. The American victory there convinced France, still bitter over its losses in the 7 Years' War, to formally enter the conflict as an American ally. French money, troops, and especially naval power fundamentally changed the strategic equation. Without Saratoga and the French alliance, there is no American victory. The war effectively ended at Yorktown in 1781, where a combined American-French force trapped Cornwallis's army on a Virginia peninsula, cutting off any British escape by sea. Revolutionary outcomes and social tensions. Now here's the nuanced part that separates a 3 from a 5 on the AP exam. The revolution was genuinely transformative for some Americans and deeply disappointing for others. For white male property owners, it delivered on its promise, expanded political participation, Republican self-governance, and a new nation built on Enlightenment. For enslaved African Americans, the revolution's ideals were largely hollow. Some enslaved people did gain freedom by fighting for the British. Lord Dunmore's proclamation of 1775 promised freedom to enslaved people who escaped Patriot masters and joined British forces. But the new American Republic enshrined slavery in its compromises from the very start. Women also played critical roles managing farms and businesses during the war, participating in boycotts, sewing uniforms, yet the revolution produced no meaningful expansion of their legal or political rights. Abigail Adams famously asked John Adams to remember the ladies, and John Adams famously did not. Native Americans, many of whom had allied with the British as a buffer against colonial expansion, found the peace treaty of 1783 a disaster. Britain ceded their lands without consulting them at all. A useful mnemonic for the revolution's contradictions. Vif women, indigenous peoples, freedom seekers, enslaved people, and elites. Ask yourself, who won, who lost, and who was left out? The AP exam loves asking you to evaluate the revolution's revolutionary nature through exactly that lens. The Articles of Confederation, already in trouble. The revolution also produced America's first attempt at a national government. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781. Spoiler, it was a mess. The founders terrified of recreating the tyranny they just fought against, created a central government so weak it couldn't tax, couldn't enforce laws, and couldn't regulate commerce. Think of it as designing a car with no engine because you were scared of speeding. That weakness set the stage for everything that comes next in Period 3. With the revolution's ideals freshly established and its contradictions already visible, we turn now to the challenge of actually building a functioning republic out of the rubble of colonial rule. Part 3.6. The Influence of Revolutionary Ideals. The revolution doesn't end when the fighting does. Here's something that trips up a lot of students. They think the American Revolution was just a war. Win the battles, sign a treaty, done. But the real revolution, the one that mattered most for the long haul, was happening in people's minds. The ideas that justified breaking from Britain didn't just disappear after Yorktown. They kept spreading, kept evolving, and kept bumping up against the uncomfortable realities of American society. That tension is exactly what this section is all about. Think of revolutionary ideals like a fire you light in your living room. It warms the house beautifully, but it doesn't stay neatly contained. It sparks, it jumps, it raises questions nobody fully anticipated. The principles of liberty, equality, and natural rights that the founders invoked against British tyranny were soon being picked up by people the founders hadn't necessarily intended to include in the conversation. The language of liberty and its contradictions. The Declaration of Independence is the key document here. Jefferson's phrase, "all men are created equal," became arguably the most powerful sentence in American political history. Not because everyone immediately lived up to it, but because people kept demanding that America live up to it. For the AP exam, you need to understand that the revolutionary rhetoric created a standard by which American society would be measured. And frankly, often found wanting. The most glaring contradiction, of course, was slavery. Enslaved people and their allies heard the language of natural rights and asked the obvious question: if liberty is an unalienable right, why does it stop at the color line? During and after the Revolution, this tension produced real results. Several northern states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, began gradual emancipation processes in the 1780s. Massachusetts essentially abolished slavery through court decisions interpreting its once 70-80 Constitution, which declared all men are born free and equal. That's the revolution's ideals doing real work in the world. But here's the AP pitfall you absolutely need to avoid. Don't assume the revolution was uniformly liberating for enslaved people. In the South, slavery actually expanded and hardened after independence. The new national government, in order to hold the fragile Union together, made constitutional compromises. The 3/5 clause, the protection of the slave trade. Until 1808, that entrenched the institution. The Revolution both challenged and reinforced slavery simultaneously, depending on where you were standing. Women and the Republican ideal. Women were another group who picked up the fire of revolutionary language. Abigail Adams famously told her husband John to remember the ladies when drafting new laws, warning that women would foment a rebellion if ignored. He essentially brushed her off, but the fact that she made the argument at all tells you something important. The concept you need to know cold for the AP exam is vir Republican motherhood vir. This was the idea that emerged after the Revolution, arguing that women, though excluded from formal political participation, served a vital civic role by raising virtuous, educated citizens, especially sons who would participate in the Republic. It's a fascinating ideological compromise. On one hand, it elevated the status of women and justified female education. On the other hand, it kept women firmly in the domestic sphere, channeling their influence through their husbands and children rather than through direct political power. Think of it as the founders saying, "You matter enormously. Just stay in the kitchen while you matter." Republican motherhood is a favorite AP concept because it shows how revolutionary ideals were selectively applied. It gave women a meaningful but carefully bounded role, acknowledging their importance while denying them full citizenship. The democratic impulse and social hierarchy. The revolution also shook up class dynamics in ways that made elites deeply nervous. Ordinary farmers, artisans, and laborers had fought and died in the war, and many of them came home expecting a more democratic society. They challenged property requirements for voting, questioned the authority of old aristocratic families, and pushed back against the concentration of power among wealthy merchants and landowners. This tension shows up most vividly in events like Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 1787 at Strigor, where Massachusetts farmers facing debt and foreclosure took up arms against the state government. For wealthy conservatives like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, this was a 5-alarm fire, proof that the Articles of Confederation created a government too weak to maintain order. Shays' Rebellion is one of the primary reasons the Constitutional Convention happened at all. The democratic impulse unleashed by revolutionary ideals was paradoxically one of the forces that pushed leaders toward a stronger, more centralized government that could contain popular uprisings. The global ripple effect. Don't sleep on the international dimension here. Revolutionary ideals crossed the Atlantic in both directions. The American Revolution inspired the French Revolution of 1789, which took the language of liberty and equality even further, and far more violently. Americans watched with both admiration and horror, and the question of how to respond to revolutionary France became one of the first major foreign policy debates of the new republic. Even closer to home, the Haitian Revolution beginning in 1791 showed enslaved people in the Americas that liberation was possible through force. Southern slaveholders were terrified. The revolution's ideals had traveled to the Caribbean and come back wearing a very different face. Your AP anchor phrase. If you need a mental anchor for this entire section, use this. A patriot or revolution wrote a check that American society would spend the next 2 centuries trying to cash. Liberty and equality were promised broadly, but delivered narrowly, and the struggle to close that gap is American history. That gap between promise and reality sets the stage perfectly for everything that comes next, because as we move into the early republic, the new nation will have to decide just how far those revolutionary ideals are actually supposed to reach. Part 3.7, the Articles of Confederation. America's first attempt at government. All right, so picture this. You and a bunch of roommates have just kicked out your landlord after a long, bitter dispute. You're finally free, but now someone has to be in charge of paying the utilities, making house rules, and dealing with the neighbors. Do you let one roommate have total control? Absolutely not. You just fought a war against exactly that kind of arrangement. So instead, you write up the loosest, most limited agreement possible, where everyone keeps their independence and nobody really has to do what anyone else says. That, in essence, is the Articles of Confederation. Ratified in 1781, the Articles of Confederation were America's first constitution, the document that defined how the new nation would govern itself during and immediately after the Revolutionary War. And understanding why it was designed the way it was is just as important as understanding what it actually did. The founders were terrified of centralized power. They had just lived through what they believed was tyranny under the British Crown. So their instinct was to build a government that simply could not accumulate too much authority. The result was a firm league of friendship among 13 sovereign states, not a true national government. What the Articles actually did and didn't do. Under the Articles, Congress could do a few meaningful things. It could declare war and make peace, conduct foreign affairs, manage relations with Native Americans, coin money, and run a post office. These weren't nothing. But here's where you need to pay close attention for the AP exam, because the weaknesses are where all the test questions live. Congress under the Articles could not tax. Let that sink in. The national government had to ask, essentially beg the states for money, and the states could simply say no. It also could not regulate interstate or foreign commerce, which meant states were slapping tariffs on each other like rival countries. There was no executive branch to enforce laws and no national judiciary to interpret them. And perhaps most crippling of all, to amend the Articles, you needed unanimous consent from all 13 states. Try getting 13 people to agree on anything unanimously, and you'll understand why reform was nearly impossible. A great mnemonic to remember the core weaknesses is no teen, no taxes, no executive, no commerce regulation, no enforcement power. That covers the big 4 issues that will show up on multiple choice questions. The Northwest Ordinance, a genuine success. Now here's something AP students often get wrong. They assume the Articles period was a complete disaster with nothing to show for it. Don't fall into that trap. Congress, under the Articles, actually passed one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This law established a clear process for admitting new states from the territory north of the Ohio River, present-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It guaranteed civil liberties in the territory, prohibited slavery north of the Ohio River, a genuinely significant anti-slavery provision, and laid out a three-stage path from territory to statehood. This is a big deal. The Northwest Ordinance essentially became the template for westward expansion for the next century. Remember, the Articles era wasn't all failure. Shays' Rebellion, the crisis that changed everything. But the failures were real and dramatic. The most vivid example is Shays' Rebellion of 1786 to 1787 Ben. The national government under the Articles was powerless to respond. It had no army to send and no money to raise one quickly. Here is the key AP connection. Shays' Rebellion scared the pants off wealthy landowners, merchants, and political elites across the country. It wasn't just a Massachusetts problem. It was proof that the Articles couldn't maintain order. This fear accelerated calls for stronger central government and became the most direct catalyst for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. When you see a question asking why the founders gathered in Philadelphia, Shays' Rebellion is almost always part of the correct answer. The big tension, liberty versus order. The deeper lesson of the Articles period, and this is the kind of analytical thinking the AP exam rewards, is that it exposed a fundamental tension in American political thought between liberty and order. The Articles prioritized liberty so aggressively that it sacrificed the order necessary for a functioning society. Economic chaos, foreign nations refusing to take the U.S. seriously, and domestic uprisings all pointed to the same problem. The pendulum needed to swing back toward a stronger central authority, but not so far that it recreated the tyranny they'd escaped. A common AP pitfall: don't confuse the Articles' weaknesses as evidence that the founders were incompetent. They were making deliberate ideological choices rooted in their lived experience. The Articles worked the way they were designed to work. The problem was that the design reflected fears that, once tested by reality, proved inadequate for governing a new nation. With those tensions fully established, you're perfectly set up to understand why the Constitutional Convention of 1787 unfolded the way it did, and why every compromise made there was essentially a direct response to the failures you just learned about. Part 3.8. The Constitutional Convention and Debates over Ratification. Setting the stage. Why Philadelphia 1787? Imagine you and your friends built a treehouse together, wrote up a quick list of rules on a napkin, and then realized 3 years later that nobody could agree on anything. The whole structure was wobbling, and you had no way to make anyone actually follow the rules. That's essentially where the United States found itself under the Articles of Confederation. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787, a desperate uprising of Massachusetts farmers who couldn't pay their debts, was the moment the founders looked at each other and said, "Okay, we need a real plan." The Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia in May 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles, but the delegates, 55 men, no women, overwhelmingly wealthy and educated, quietly decided to scrap them entirely and start over. That's your first AP pitfall right there. The convention was called to fix the Articles, but ended up replacing them. The Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise. The two biggest fights in Philadelphia weren't philosophical, they were political. The first was about representation. Large states loved the Virginia Plan, which proposed a bicameral legislature with seats based on population. Small states loved the New Jersey Plan, which kept the one state, one vote model of the Articles. The Connecticut Compromise, also called the Great Compromise, split the difference beautifully. a Senate with equal representation for every state, and a House of Representatives apportioned by population. Think of it like a dinner table where everyone gets the same vote on what to order, but the bill gets divided by how many people are at each table. The second fight was uglier. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted toward their population for representation. Exam loves to ask you about the long-term consequences of this. It entrenched slaveholders' political power in Congress for decades. Federalists versus anti-federalists, the great debate. Once the delegates signed the document in September 1787, it had to be ratified by 9 of 13 states, and that's where the real intellectual war began. On one side stood the Federalists Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who anonymously co-authored the Federalist Papers to make the case for ratification. Madison's Federalist Note Never Tend is an AP essential. His argument, a large republic actually controls factionalism better than a small one, because no single group can dominate a vast, diverse population. It's counterintuitive, kind of like saying a big city has less road rage than a small town, because there are too many routes to get stuck in any one traffic jam. On the other side were the anti-federalists, figures like Patrick Henry and George Mason, who had two core fears. First, the new federal government was too powerful and would swallow up state authority. Second, and critically, there was no Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. They were deeply suspicious, shaped by their fresh memories of British overreach, and they weren't wrong to ask hard questions. A helpful mnemonic. Think of the anti-federalists as the SEEHEQ crowd. They wanted states' rights protection from an states' rights protection from a authoritarian center. Freedom guarantees in writing. And this what the Constitution actually did. The Constitution established a federal system, sovereignty shared between national and state governments, and built in the famous separation of powers across 3 branches. The system of checks and balances ensured no single branch could go full tyrant. One concept students consistently mix up is the difference between federalism, the division of power between national and state governments, and separation of powers. The division of power within the national government among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, these are 2 different architectural blueprints operating simultaneously. The promise to add a Bill of Rights was actually the key to getting ratification over the finish line. Several states ratified only on the condition that amendments protecting individual rights would follow, and they did in 1791. So the anti-federalists didn't lose entirely. They forced one of the most important additions to American democracy. Common AP pitfalls. Students often confuse the timeline. The Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention, ratification, and the Bill of Rights are 4 separate moments spread across a decade. Don't collapse them. Also remember that the Federalist Papers were persuasive documents, political advocacy, not neutral analysis, though they remain invaluable for understanding the founders' original intent. And never forget that the debates over ratification weren't just abstract philosophy. They were arguments about power, slavery, commerce, and who gets to be heard in the new republic. The tensions born at Philadelphia between federal and state authority, between liberty and order, between the interests of large and small states didn't resolve neatly in 1788. They carried right into the 1790s, where a new set of crises would force the young nation to test just how well that constitutional framework actually held together. Part 3.9, the Constitution. From crisis to convention. Let's pick up right where the Articles of Confederation left us. basically stranded on the side of the road with a broken-down car. Chase's rebellion in 1786 was the moment most American leaders looked at each other and said, "Okay, we have a real problem here." When Massachusetts farmers started shutting down Kurth houses with pitchforks and muskets because they couldn't pay their debts, it wasn't just a local disturbance, it was a flashing red warning light that the national government had no power to maintain order, regulate commerce, or protect property. That fear drove 55 delegates to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles. What they ended up doing was something far more dramatic, scrapping the whole thing and starting over. The Great Debates. Think of the Constitutional Convention as a negotiating table with several fault lines running through it. The first big crack was between large and small states. Virginia's James Madison walked in with the Virginia Plan, essentially a blueprint that gave big populous states proportional representation in a bicameral legislature. New Jersey fired back with the New Jersey Plan, which kept the one state, one vote principle of the Articles. The Connecticut Compromise, sometimes called the Great Compromise, split the difference. Proportional representation in the House, equal representation in the Senate. AP exams love asking you to connect this structure to ongoing tensions between state and federal power, so burn that into your memory. The second fault line was slavery. The 3/5 compromise said that enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of congressional representation and taxation. This is one of those things students misread all the time. Enslaved people weren't getting 3/5 of citizenship or rights. This was a political calculation that gave slaveholding southern states more seats in Congress without giving enslaved people any actual political voice. It's a critical distinction on the exam. Add to that the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise, which prevented Congress from banning the international slave trade until 1808 and prohibited taxing exports, protecting southern agricultural economies. The Constitution didn't abolish slavery. It protected and institutionalized it in several places. The architecture of power. The framers were obsessed with one core problem. How do you create a government strong enough to function, but not so strong it becomes tyrannical? Their answer was a system built on separation of powers and checks and balances, the idea that no single branch could accumulate enough authority to dominate the others. Think of it like a three-legged stool. Remove any one leg and the whole thing topples. The executive enforces law. The legislature makes it. The judiciary interprets it. And each branch has tools to restrain the others. The president can veto legislation. Congress can override that veto. The Senate confirms judicial appointments. Courts can strike down laws. It's beautifully paranoid engineering. Federalism, the division of power between national and state governments, is another cornerstone concept. The Constitution created a federal system that was deliberately different from the near-total state sovereignty under the Articles. Enumerated powers belong explicitly to Congress, like coining money and declaring war, while the 10th Amendment reserved other powers to the states. The elastic clause or necessary and proper clause gave Congress flexibility to stretch its enumerated powers. And this tension between strict and loose interpretation of federal power would define American political debates for generations. Ratification. Federalists versus anti-federalists. Once the Constitution left Philadelphia, it had to be sold to the states. This is where the Federalist Papers become essential, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Under the pen name Publius, these 85 essays made the intellectual case for ratification. Federal Num 10 is the one you absolutely need to know. Madison's argument that a large republic would actually control factionalism better than a small one, because no single faction could dominate a diverse national landscape. Federalist number 51 makes the case for checks and balances. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The anti-federalists, figures like Patrick Henry and George Mason, weren't just being obstructionist. They had genuine concerns. A strong central government threatened liberty. There was no Bill of Rights, and the Constitution gave too much power to distant elites. Their pressure was directly responsible for the first 10 amendments the Bill of Rights ratified in 1791. Without anti-federalist opposition, that protection of individual liberties likely never gets added. 8 pitfalls and memory anchors. A common exam mistake is conflating the Constitutional Convention's purpose with its outcome. Remember, Delegates were sent to amend the Articles, not replace them. Another pitfall is forgetting that the Constitution was a series of compromises, not a perfect document reflecting unified beliefs. Every major feature was contested. A useful mnemonic for the major compromises: a GST Great Compromise, representation slave trade compromise, 1 deadline, 3/5 counting enslaved people. Also remember the ratification threshold. 9 of 13 states needed to approve. Delaware went first, Rhode Island went last, and only after the Bill of Rights was already in motion. With the Constitution now ratified and the new government taking shape, our next stop is watching that government actually run for the first time and discovering just how quickly disagreements over its meaning would tear the founders' friendship apart. Part 3.12, Shaping a New Republic. All right, so imagine you've just won a massive argument with your parents about the House rules, and now they're saying, fine, you run things. Exciting, right? Terrifying, actually. That's essentially the situation the founders found themselves in after the revolution. They'd torn down one government, now had to build something entirely new from scratch, with everyone watching and nobody agreeing on how to do it. Welcome to the messy, fascinating business of shaping a new republic. The Articles of Confederation. The first draft nobody loved. The first attempt at national government was the Articles of Confederation ratified in 1781. Think of it as a rough draft. It existed. It functioned, but barely. Under the Articles, the national government was deliberately kept weak because Americans were terrified of recreating the kind of centralized power they just fought to escape. Congress couldn't levy taxes directly, couldn't regulate trade between states, and needed unanimous consent from all 13 states to amend anything. That last one is the killer detail the AP loves to test. One state could hold the whole system hostage. The results were predictably chaotic. States were printing their own money, slapping tariffs on each other's goods like rival food trucks, competing on the same block. And the national government couldn't pay its war debt. Then came Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787. A group of indebted Massachusetts farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, took up arms to shut down courts that were foreclosing on their land. The Articles government had no army to respond. That moment was a wake-up call for the founders. The ship of state was sinking, and a patch job wouldn't fix it. The Constitutional Convention, a closed-door negotiation. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, ostensibly, to revise the Articles, but they quickly decided to scrap the whole thing and start over. This is a classic AP pitfall. Students sometimes say the convention was called to write a new constitution. But officially, the mandate was just to revise. The delegates exceeded their authority, and most of them knew it. What emerged from those sweltering months was a masterpiece of political compromise. The Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, resolved the conflict between large and small states by creating a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate with equal representation for each state. Remember it this way: House equals head count, Senate equals same for everyone, as to read you. Another critical deal was the 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for apportionment purposes. This is one of the most morally significant and exam-significant moments in the document's origins, and you should understand it as a direct concession to Southern slaveholding interests that embedded inequality into the constitutional structure from day one. The new framework also established separation of powers across 3 branches and a system of checks and balances, so no single branch could dominate. If the Articles were a car with no engine, the Constitution was a car with an engine, a steering wheel, and brakes designed to move, but also to stop itself from going off a cliff. Ratification. Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Getting the Constitution approved was its own battle. The Federalists, led intellectually by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay through the Federalist Papers, argued that a strong central government was necessary to protect liberty, not threaten it. Their essays are dense, but the AP loves Federalist No. 10. Madison's argument that a large republic could control the dangers of factionalism. And Federalist No. 51, the ambition must be made to counteract ambition argument for checks and balances. Drill those numbers. Anti-Federalists, like Patrick Henry, pushed back hard, warning that the Constitution lacked protections for individual rights and that a powerful central government would inevitably become tyrannical. Their concerns weren't unreasonable, and ultimately they won a key concession: the promise of a Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments, ratified in 1791, were the price of ratification in 1791, were the price of ratification in several key states. Without that promise, the Constitution may never have passed. Hamilton's financial vision and the emergence of parties. Once the government was up and running, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton laid out an ambitious economic plan: assume state debts, create a national bank, and promote manufacturing. His reports to Congress essentially proposed making the U.S. government a credit-worthy, commercially driven national power. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed almost all of it, arguing that a national bank was unconstitutional, no explicit authority in the document, and that Hamilton's vision favored wealthy merchants over agrarian farmers. This wasn't just a policy disagreement, it was a fundamental argument about what kind of country America should be. Out of this friction grew the first American political parties: the Federalists, Hamilton's camp, and the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's camp. Political parties, ironically, were something the founders had desperately hoped to avoid. One mnemonic worth keeping handy: MDB, DBB, debt assumption, excise tax, bank tariffs, and bond sales, to remember the main pillars of Hamilton's financial program. The common AP mistake here is conflating the Federalist Party with the Federalists, who supported ratification. They overlap in personnel but aren't identical. Madison supported ratification and then opposed Hamilton, which trips up a lot of students. As you can see, the New Republic was anything but a smooth, triumphant victory lap. It was a decade of intense argument, creative compromise, and real political conflict that set the template for American governance ever after. And that tension between federal power and individual or state rights, it doesn't go away. It follows us straight into the conflicts of the early republic, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 3.11, Developing an American Identity. What does it even mean to be American? Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine you've just won a war against the most powerful empire on earth. You've got a new country, a new government, and a new flag, but do you have a new identity? That's the fascinating puzzle at the heart of this section. After the Revolution, Americans weren't just building institutions, they were inventing themselves, and it wasn't clean or easy or unanimous. It was messy, contested, and genuinely exciting. The AP exam loves this topic because it sits at the intersection of politics, culture, and society. You need to understand not just what Americans did after independence, but what they believed about themselves and how those beliefs sometimes contradicted their actions. Republican ideology and its cultural ripple effects. Let's start with the big idea: republicanism. By this point in your studies, you know republicanism means civic virtue, representative government, and the rejection of monarchy. But here's what often gets overlooked. Republicanism wasn't just a political philosophy, it was a lifestyle brand. Americans began applying Republican values to everything: education, fashion, architecture, and the arts. Think of it like this. When a new tech startup disrupts an industry, suddenly everything takes on that brand's aesthetic. The minimalist design, the casual office culture, the mission statements about changing the world. Republicanism did the same thing in post-revolutionary America. If kings had elaborate palaces and powdered wigs, then virtuous American citizens should be simple, practical, and self-reliant. This is why you see figures like Benjamin Franklin deliberately presenting himself as a plain, homespun philosopher rather than an aristocratic gentleman. The costume was the message. This cultural shift had real consequences for how Americans thought about education. Republican thinkers, and remember this for your exam, argued that a self-governing republic required an educated citizenry. You can't have voters making decisions for the nation if they can't read or reason. This is the intellectual foundation behind the Northwest Ordinance's famous land grant provisions for public education, and behind reformers like Noah Webster, who literally rewrote the dictionary to give Americans a distinctly American version of the English language. Webster wasn't just a grammar nerd, he was a nation builder. The arts and the search for an American character. Here's where it gets really interesting. Americans after the Revolution desperately wanted a distinctive cultural identity, but they kept running into an uncomfortable American writers and painters turned to the landscape itself. The vast wilderness, the frontier, the sheer scale of the continent as the source of a unique national character. This is why you start seeing paintings of dramatic mountain ranges and untamed forests in this era. Nature became the American equivalent of Europe's ancient cathedrals and ruins. It was saying, we don't have centuries of history, but we have this. A useful mnemonic here is N-A-L. Nature, agriculture, liberty. These three concepts weave together in how Americans constructed their identity. The yeoman farmer, independent, hardworking, connected to the land, became the symbolic ideal of the American Republican citizen. Thomas Jefferson most famously articulated this vision, arguing that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God when it comes to civic virtue. Remember that image. It comes up again and again on the AP exam. The contradictions you cannot ignore. Now here's where you need to be sharp. Because the AP exam will absolutely test your ability to identify contradictions and tensions rather than just recite the happy story. The same era that celebrated liberty and Republican equality was also the era of expanding slavery, the dispossession of Native Americans, and the legal subordination of women. This is not a coincidence. It's a structural tension. The very language of natural rights and universal equality that patriots used to justify revolution created an ideological pressure that groups like free Black Americans, enslaved people, and women would eventually use to demand their own inclusion. Abigail Adams' famous "Remember the Lady's Letter to John Adams" is your go-to example here. She was using the revolution's own logic against its limitations. One common AP pitfall is treating this era as purely triumphant nation building. While ignoring these fault lines, a strong essay will acknowledge that American identity in this period was being contested, not just constructed. Different groups had radically different visions of what the new nation should be, and those conflicts didn't disappear. They went underground and resurfaced later. Putting it together for the exam. When you see a prompt about post-revolutionary American identity, think in terms of three layers. First, the ideological layer, Republican values, natural rights, civic virtue. Second, the cultural layer, art, education, language, and the celebration of the American landscape. Third, and most importantly for earning those top scores, the contested layer. Who was included in this new identity? Who was excluded? And why those exclusions created contradictions that couldn't be permanently resolved. The genius of this period is that Americans were simultaneously the most idealistic nation on earth and deeply structurally unjust. Holding both of those truths at once is what the AP graders are looking for in your writing. As we move into the political conflicts of the 1790s, you'll see exactly how these competing visions of American identity exploded into open partisan warfare between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and why the question of what America should be was anything but settled. Part 3.12 Movement in the Early Republic. Why people were on the move. All right, so picture this. The ink is barely dry on the Constitution. The new republic is still figuring out what it even is, and yet millions of people are packing up and heading somewhere new. The early republic was a society in motion, literally. Understanding who was moving, where they were going, and why is absolutely essential for the AP exam. And honestly, it's one of the most human stories in all of American history. Let's start with the big picture. After the Revolution, the new United States had a serious real estate situation on its hands. The 1783 Treaty of Paris handed America an enormous swath of territory stretching to the Mississippi River. That land became a giant magnet. The question wasn't whether people would move into it. It was whether the federal government could manage that movement in an orderly way. Spoiler, it was complicated. The Northwest Ordinance and westward migration. Here is where your first key concept locks in. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 were the federal government's attempt to bring order to westward expansion. Think of the Northwest Ordinance as the rule book for turning wilderness into states. It established that new territories could eventually become equal states, not colonies of the East Coast. That was a genuinely radical idea. It also notably banned slavery north of the Ohio River, which becomes a huge foreshadowing detail for everything that happens in the 19th century. For the AP exam, remember this relationship. Westward migration created pressure on indigenous nations, which created conflict, which required federal response, which revealed tensions between federal power and settler ambitions. That chain reaction shows up on multiple choice questions and long essay prompts constantly. Indigenous displacement and resistance. Now here's where a lot of students lose points. They forget that westward expansion wasn't moving into empty land. Indigenous peoples had complex functioning societies throughout the Trans-Appalachian West, and they resisted displacement fiercely. After the Revolution, many Native nations had allied with the British, and the peace treaty essentially abandoned them. The British handed over native land they didn't even own. The result? Ongoing warfare. The Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 and the subsequent Treaty of Greenville in 1795 are your key events here. General Anthony Wayne's victory over a confederacy of native nations opened the Ohio Valley to American settlement and forced a significant cession of territory. For AP purposes, this demonstrates how military power backed up federal land policy. The federal government wasn't just drawing lines on maps. It was enforcing them with soldiers. Common pitfall. Don't frame indigenous resistance as simply losing. Many nations engaged in sophisticated diplomacy, formed pan-tribal confederacies, and successfully delayed American expansion for decades. The story isn't one of inevitable defeat. It's one of contested power. The migration of enslaved people. Here's the piece that students most often underemphasize and examiners notice. Westward expansion didn't just move free settlers, it moved slavery. As tobacco exhausted the soil of Virginia and Maryland, planters looked south and west toward fresh, fertile land. The cotton gin's invention in 1793 turbocharged this process. Enslaved people were forcibly relocated, torn from families, communities, and everything familiar to work new plantations in Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. This is the internal slave trade in its early stages, and it is brutal in ways the textbook language can sometimes sanitize. Think about what it means for an enslaved person when their enslaver moves west. It means everything they've built, relationships, small acts of autonomy, community gets wiped out. The AP exam will expect you to connect westward migration to the expansion and entrenchment of slavery, not just to the adventures of pioneer settlers. Urbanization and immigration in the Atlantic world. Movement in the early republic wasn't only westward. Cities along the eastern seaboard, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, were growing rapidly. Immigration from Europe, particularly from Ireland and Germany, was beginning to reshape urban demographics. This created new social tensions, new labor markets, and new questions about what American identity actually meant. The yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793 is a striking example of how urban migration created vulnerability. When thousands of people crowd into a city with poor sanitation, disease spreads fast. That epidemic killed roughly 5,000 people, about 10% of the city's population, and temporarily drove the federal government out of the nation's capital. It's a vivid reminder that movement had consequences, both intended and devastating. Connecting it all, a mnemonic to lock it in. Here is a memory trick. Think of the word WINS for the four major migration streams of the early republic. Eftred, Vistward settler migration. Eftred, indigenous displacement and resistance. Eftred, Stour South movement of slavery. And Eftred, seaboard urban growth. Any AP prompt about movement in this period is really asking you to discuss one or more of these four forces intersecting with each other. The big takeaway the AP examiners want you to demonstrate is that movement in the early republic was never neutral. Every journey someone took was shaped by power, who had it, who was forced by it, and who was trying to survive it. Free settlers moved by choice. Enslaved people moved by compulsion. Indigenous peoples were moved by force. Holding all three of those experiences in your minds simultaneously is what separates a 3 from a 5. As we move into the next section, you'll see how these patterns of migration and displacement set the stage for the explosive territorial and political conflicts of the 19th century. The seeds planted here bloom into the crises that define Period 4. Part 3.13, Continuity and Change in Period 3. All right, let's take a breath. You've just sprinted through one of the most dramatic periods in American history: wars, revolutions, constitutional crises, rebellions, and now it's time to pull back and ask the big question that the AP exam loves to ask. What actually changed, and what stubbornly stayed the same? This is the continuity and change over time lens, and mastering it is the difference between a 3 and a 5. The big picture framework. Think of period 3, 1754 to 1800, like a major home renovation. When it's done, your house looks completely different from the outside: new paint, new layout. Maybe a whole new addition, but underneath, the foundation is the same. The plumbing runs the same roots. Some of the old furniture is still sitting in the corner. That's exactly what happened to American society between the French and Indian War and the end of John Adams's presidency. The structure of the new nation looked revolutionary, but dig into the walls and you'll find a lot of familiar material. What changed? The most obvious change is political. The colonies went from being subjects of a constitutional monarchy to citizens of a democratic republic, and that is genuinely radical for the 18th century. The idea that government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and then institutionalized through the Constitution, represented a fundamental break from inherited monarchical tradition. No more divine right, no more parliament taxing people without representation. The Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution were attempts, imperfect, contested, ongoing, to answer the question, what does self-governance actually look like in practice? Don't forget the ideological shift either. Republicanism, the idea that virtuous citizens must actively participate in and sacrifice for the common good, replaced the old deferential colonial mindset where you trusted your betters to govern. Related to this, Enlightenment thinking about natural rights gained enormous popular currency. These weren't just ideas for elites in coffee houses. They filtered into how ordinary Americans understood their relationship to authority. What stayed the same? Here's where students get tripped up on the AP exam, and this is the most important thing I want you to hear today. The revolution did not revolutionize everything. For enslaved Black Americans, the continuity is devastating and deliberate. The ideals of liberty and equality articulated in the Declaration coexisted comfortably for most white founders with the expansion and legal entrenchment of slavery. The Constitution protected the slave trade until 1808, counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, and required the return of fugitives. Freedom in the new republic was largely a white man's inheritance. Similarly, the status of women changed very little in legal or political terms. The Republican motherhood ideal, the idea that women served the Republic by raising virtuous male citizens, gave women a new cultural significance, but it did not give them the vote, property rights, or legal independence from their husbands. It's a classic AP trick to ask whether Republican motherhood represents change or continuity. The answer is both. It's a new ideological framework, but it still confines women to the domestic sphere. Abigail Adams famously told John to remember the ladies, and famously, he did not. Economic structures also showed remarkable continuity. The plantation economy of the South deepened rather than dissolved. Merchant capitalism in the North continued along familiar colonial lines. The debate over Hamilton's financial program, the bank assumption of debts, tariffs, was essentially a debate about which direction to develop economically, not whether to restructure society from the ground up. The A pitfall to avoid. The most common mistake on continuity and change essays is arguing that everything either changed completely or stayed exactly the same. The AP readers want nuance. They want you to say the political system was transformed, but the social hierarchies of race and gender persisted. Use the word, however, like it owes you money. Practice writing thesis statements that acknowledge both sides. Something like, while the American Revolution fundamentally altered the political relationship between citizens and government, it largely preserved existing social and economic hierarchies, particularly regarding race and gender. A helpful mnemonic for this period is FRACE, P-R-A-C-E. Politics changed, republicanism emerged. African Americans remained enslaved. Colonial economics continued. Enlightenment ideas spread. It's not perfect, but it gives you 5 talking points to anchor an essay under pressure. Connecting the threads. What makes period 3 so rich and so testable is precisely this tension between the revolutionary and the conservative. The founders were simultaneously radical and elites, visionaries and slaveholders, idealists and pragmatists. They built something genuinely new, and they protected something deeply old. Understanding that contradiction is not cynicism, it's historical sophistication. At that sophistication of his and that sophistication of his as you move into period 4, you'll see how these unresolved tensions over slavery, federal power, and who truly belongs in the republic explode into the crises of the early 19th century, so keep these threads in your hands as we turn them